this story for us from a couple different perspectives. NBC News Capitol correspondent Casey Hunt, and joining me on set, our national security reporter Ken Delaney. And Casey, let me start with you up on the Hill. By the way, it wasn't just Democrats that weren't getting their answer question. Marco Rubio as well, with answering the obvious question. When they were denying a specific, he went for the general, and then they wouldn't talk about it. What is the real rationale? What are you hearing? Did they do it in closed session? Did they get their questions answered in at least a closed, non-public setting?
It doesn't sound like it, Chuck. The briefing that they had behind closed doors was mostly with technical staff later on today. We do know that Admiral Rogers had at least one private meeting with Adam Schiff, who's actually over here on the House side. We don't know much about the contents of that meeting. We know it wasn't related to the committee. But the frustration on the part of members from both parties is very real here, and I think represents a real risk for President Trump. It's clear that neither one of these men who were in the spotlight today, wanted to be the center of attention in any of this, and they certainly were pretty careful to make sure they didn't give any ammunition to the president's opponents here in Congress. But I think that really sharpened the divide between Republicans in Congress, who I would characterize as skeptical of the president. Look, most of them, frankly, are skeptical privately, but you're seeing more of them be willing to be more skeptical in public. This was another example of Marco Rubio being willing to do that. John McCain has obviously been a critic, but he used the word Orwellian to describe the difference between what these two men were saying and what has been published in the press about what has happened. I thought that was remarkable.
I'm glad you brought up the John McCain, and I don't think we have that fully here on this front. We've had so much on our plate. Ken, look, let's go through what the Washington Post reported here, that apparently both Dan Coats and Mike Rogers were in some form, the president asked them, at least with Dan Coats, were they willing to, I don't know, when you want to put in a good word with, if they were willing to talk to Comey. Explain what we know.
There are actually two stories, one of which we at NBC News, I personally have confirmed. It's an earlier story from a few weeks ago that both Rogers and Coats were asked by Donald Trump on separate occasions to say publicly that they had seen no evidence of collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. And I'm told that both men found that request to be inappropriate, and that Rogers caused a memo to be written about this. And he was asked about this today, and he didn't comment. Right. What's interesting about today's session is these guys didn't even come to the hearing prepared with a good answer about why they didn't want to talk about it.
It was coordinated.
Was it?
I thought that was interesting. Both Rogers and Coats, it felt as if they discussed how they were going to answer this question, because they both answered it the same way.
The same way, but they couldn't say, were they citing executive privilege? Was it because it was classified? They kept changing their answer about that. And, these guys work for the American public as well as the president. The public is owed answers about this. And Angus King is a pretty mild-mannered guy, as Casey well knows, former college instructor at Bowdoin. He was furious today. He asked some very good questions.
Casey, I want to go back to what John McCain said. He was clearly frustrated with Dan Coats, not necessarily personally, but sort of how the whole thing, he said, so the Washington Post has all of this detail about what the president asked of you. What did the Post get right or wrong? And it was awkward because Coats wouldn't deny a single individual fact in the Post story, but then generally characterized it oddly. Fill in the gaps here.
Yeah, well, and he was very vague about what details were correct, what were not correct, and he essentially said, I've been in Washington long enough that I don't believe every word that's written in the Washington Post. But at the same time, he wouldn't say which of these words were to be not believed, which words were to be actually believed. Clearly, what we have since learned in the intervening hours of the afternoon is that quite a bit of detail that was reported in the press has now been corroborated on the record by the former FBI director. So kind of a difficult back and forth with the two of them there. I mean, McCain has obviously been around here, too, a long time. The one thing I will say, to Ken's point on Angus King, he's actually somebody that I always watch in these hearings, because this is not the first time Angus King has made news in a session like this. And he does come across as kind of a mild-mannered guy, but he is somebody who, and I've been, on the receiving end of this, if you got your facts wrong and you ask him a question, he will snap at you right away. And I think he's going to be really somebody to watch tomorrow as well.
That's a fair point. I want to go back to another person that testified today that sort of it got a little bit lost, and that's Andrew McCabe, who currently is the acting director of the FBI. Two things of note there. One, he was pressed about look, Comey we had known that he had briefed McCabe on his interactions with the president, and that was in published reports. Now, McCabe testified before Comey's statement came out, but McCabe refused to talk about his interactions with Comey, so yet he was a third individual that would not answer any questions, and it wasn't executive privilege, it's because it's classified, it was simply, well, we're going to let Comey speak for himself.
Well, he also said that this could fall under Robert Mueller's investigation, which I found interesting because, you know what, it could. If Robert Mueller's investigating the president for obstruction of justice, we don't know. James Comey assured the president that he wasn't a target of an investigation. We don't know whether that's still true.
No, we don't. And the other thing interesting on McCabe is that it was on President Trump's mind, according to Comey in his memo, when he associated McCabe immediately with Terry McAuliffe, the governor of Virginia. Explain why.
Because McCabe's wife, I don't know if I have my facts right.
Ran for office.
As a Democratic activist.
And ran for office in Virginia,
right.
and somehow that's all connected to Clinton emails.
Exactly.
Right. If you connect the dots somewhere in Richmond to Anchorage, Alaska.
Trump would raise this in a meeting with Comey.
He raised it in a meeting with Comey. Very interesting. Anyway, Casey and Ken, thank you both.
Thanks,
Wait till tomorrow.